Peterson, Minister Rogers, distinguished panelists, diplomats, guests, friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Symposium, The Fight Against Hunger, the History and the Future of the Irish Role in Humanitarian Assistance. It is born from a series of conversations between our Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs at Fordham University and the Clinton Institute of University College Dublin. Both Liam Kennedy, the director of the Clinton Institute, and I wanted to begin a series of joint initiatives based on our individual strengths and our shared visions. This could not have been achieved without the hard work and dedication of our mutual friend and matchmaker, Tim O'Connor, and the heroic efforts of Catherine Carey of the Clinton Institute and Jenna Fells and Laura Rissamini of the IIHA. It is apt that this first symposium is here in New York and here at Fordham. Fordham University was founded by an Irishman, Archbishop John Hughes, to provide education to those in New York who were at that time the most vulnerable, the Irish and Catholic masses, all of whom had poured into its ports in the wake of the Irish famine, the Great Hunger. It is right that we as a university should both examine, critique, and celebrate the role of the Irish in humanitarian action, for it is a history that is born out of hardship and loss and suffering. When we look at Irish history in general, very often we look first at the tragedy, the famine, the beginning of mass immigration to the US, to Canada, to Australia. And yet, despite that heartbreak, there's this story of a phoenix-like rebirth in the Irish influence on those countries, on the political and business histories of those larger nations. Where other countries had financial or military might, the Irish had faith, strength, and courage to leave their homes while maintaining their identity, an ethical compass, and a strong sense of their own culture from afar. For the idea of Ireland, the nation of Ireland, is larger than its borders, than its physical space. And we, the members of that diaspora, have a responsibility to contribute to the dialogue on how Ireland will prosper in the 21st century. And we look at that history, missionaries who left Kerry and Cork and every other county, every family, every generation seemed to have a missionary who worked abroad, coming back once every blue moon at Christmas to tell stories of worlds that could not be imagined. And then in the 70s, you had the great growth in the young Irish joining charities and organizations to work overseas. The heroic work of Angus Finucane in Biafra, the Trocars, the Goals, who have joined up, and people joining them. With economic success in Dublin came a strong sense of commitment to Irish development policies by the government that reflected similar efforts in culture and academia. The recent economic downturn has forced the government to do more with less. And today, to begin the program, we are honored to have Brendan Rogers, the Director General of the Development Cooperation Directorate at Irish Aid, as well as being the Deputy Secretary General of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, speak to us before this formal program begins. So again, welcome. I welcome Brendan to address the group, and then we'll start the formal program. Thank you very much.
Boidir Galer. Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Brendan. And I would also like to thank, obviously, the Clinton Institute and the Institute for International Humanitarian Affairs for convening this important and groundbreaking forum. I'm certainly very grateful for the opportunity to join the discussion about the fight against hunger and the important role of emergency humanitarian assistance in this fight. As all of you know, I think, combating hunger and undernutrition is now a central pillar of Ireland's foreign policy and our development assistance programme known by the public as Irish Aid. In my opinion, although much has been written, said and done about humanitarian aid, we still have a long way to go, particularly in achieving and measuring tangible impacts. And we have much to learn from each other, and we do that today, I hope. I'll also touch today on the history of Ireland's official humanitarian response, provide an overview of our current endeavours and how they are evolving, and outline the challenges we all face. I also want to put forward 3 practical proposals for greater effectiveness in the next generation of humanitarian aid. As someone responsible for both the policy and the practice of Irish aid, I believe that our conversation here today comes at an important time. The increasing frequency and intensity of disasters remains a major threat to long-term food and nutrition security of the poorest and the most vulnerable people in developing countries. In the year 2011 alone, 302 disasters, 29,782,000 lives affected. People dead, 380 billion. That's the cost currently. So the reality is that it is the poor and the marginalised who die in greater numbers, and those who survive endure higher economic loss because of those disasters. The food and nutrition security of the poor and marginalised is more at risk because they eke out their livelihoods in the riskiest environments, in situations of conflict, in drought-prone areas, in swamps, in flood-prone riverbanks of congested urban settlements. Their food and fuel prices are increasing as their livelihood options radically diminish. Additionally, disasters increase gender inequality, making bad situations worse for women and girls. Now, emergency humanitarian assistance has always been an important element of the Irish Aid Programme. I think it's true to say that Irish involvement in responding to large-scale man-made or natural disasters even predates the setting up of the official aid programme. As Brendan mentioned, our proud missionary tradition is a story of brave Irish women and men spanning the globe and working for justice and development. Place names such as Biafra, Congo, Ethiopia have been familiar to Irish people for many decades, and this familiarity and connection has bred empathy and concern. So why is this? Well, we have the legacy and memory of our own famine in Ireland, which, as one of the most significant defining events in our history, has served to transform us in ways that even now we're only beginning to understand. It has been convincingly argued, I think, that a collective memory of the Great Irish Famine has resulted in the deep compassion felt by the Irish people for those who suffer from poverty and hunger. And yesterday I visited that wonderful famine memorial down in Battery Park City. But isn't it amazing today that almost 800,000 New York City residents trace their ancestry to Ireland? And this is another important legacy of our shared history. A history that witnessed hundreds of thousands of Irish people fleeing hunger at home and finding refuge in this remarkable country here, where they were able to build new lives. I was in the Consul General's home yesterday, on the 50th floor of 38th Street, and we were looking at a fantastic view for those of you who have been there. I recommend it. We were looking over at that cemetery, Calvary, I think it's called. 3.5 million Irish or Irish Americans are buried in that cemetery. That was an amazing figure that I didn't really know. I just couldn't believe it. And my former colleague, Tim O'Connor, tells me that in 1860, 40% of New Yorkers were Irish born. Again, it's an incredible figure. Tim and I joined the Irish Diplomatic Service 33 years ago this week. So Irish people have always responded generously to humanitarian crises through public and private donations. To the Biafran War in the 1970s, the Ethiopian famine in the 1980s, the Somali crisis, the Rwanda genocide in the 1990s, and then the tsunami in 2004. And in the early days of our aid programme, the Irish government channeled support through Ireland's growing and active non-governmental organisations, the United Nations as well, and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements. In those days, I think humanitarian action was mostly reactive. I've been working in the field now for over 20 years, and I can certainly attest to the fact that in the early days there was a significant disconnect between humanitarian assistance and long-term development work. We were working in absolutely parallel worlds. So in those days the focus was on the immediate provision of material assistance to meet urgent, life-saving needs. And the good people who worked in those separate worlds really did not commune with each other, and well, certainly not very much. So they were guided by the humanitarian principles: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, operation independence, and they deliver the right assistance and they save lives, no doubt about that. But it's clear, ladies and gentlemen, that humanitarian landscape has changed significantly from those early days. So when the Indian Ocean tsunami struck in the early hours of December the 26th, 2004, I was called upon to lead the Irish government's response. And within a few days, I was out there. And I saw it firsthand, the devastation, 227,000 people dead across 14 countries, mostly in Indonesia, up in Banda Aceh, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand. Vital infrastructure was destroyed and up to 5 million people lost their homes or access to food and water. And the scale of the need was absolutely enormous. And the scale of response was also enormous. But many of the scenes I witnessed on the ground were absolutely chaotic. Hundreds of volunteers arriving with little guidance or preparation. Mountains of material building up at airports, including absolutely unusable clothing. Air traffic chaos. Duplication of effort, weak coordination, at least initially. Slowly those efforts improved and key lessons were learned. And I think the inability of the collective international humanitarian system to cope with that disaster really led to a major overhaul of that system and a process of humanitarian reform with new coordination and funding mechanisms which have been developed under the United Nations umbrella. Now, Ireland, I think, has been a leader and a champion of this reform process in both policy and in financial terms. And we certainly be one of the primary movers and drivers of the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, the CERF, which, as you know, is a funding reservoir which now can be drawn upon within hours of a disaster. We're one of the top 10 donors, I'm proud to say that, having delivered over 100 million since it was established in 2006. We've also supported the development of the cluster system to bring about a more efficient and effective humanitarian response. So this is essentially a series of coordination groups, each dealing with specific sectors such as shelter or sanitation, which can be immediately rolled out in a crisis zone to bring all of the various actors together. We also had to look at ourselves since 2004, and we really comprehensively reformed our own mechanisms in order to better respond to humanitarian emergencies. We knew we had to be much more proactive rather than reactive. So we've now pre-positioned funding with a number of significant humanitarian NGOs, such as Concern, Tropa, which can be immediately released to support a crisis response. And through the Irish Aid Rapid Response Corps, Ireland also supports UN partners and NGOs and immediately deploys highly skilled personnel to a disaster zone within absolutely hours of the crisis. We also currently pre-position supplies of essential humanitarian relief items in the UN humanitarian response depots, which are managed by the World Food Programme. These depots are strategically located around the globe and close to those regions which are most at risk, essentially. So this permits rapid access in the event of disaster. So as Irish Aid's modernising agenda evolved in the area of crisis response, and as we became more operational ourselves on the ground, the enormity of suffering in terms of hunger and malnutrition became very, very clear, even clearer to us. And in particular, the structural nature of that suffering also became transparent. We're all familiar with the global hunger statistics, but child malnutrition numbers bear repeating, I think. The most acute form of child malnutrition, severe acute malnutrition, affects over 19 million children and is associated with up to 2 million deaths annually. So it's absolutely clear that hunger and undernutrition could only be tackled on a truly global scale, and this would be quite a challenge, especially for a small country like Ireland working alone. So at a very practical level, together with our partners, Concern and Valid International and USAID, we supported a revolutionary approach to tackling childhood malnutrition in developing countries. This approach we piloted in Malawi initially as community-based therapeutic care, CTC, which now is called CMAM, Community Managing Acute Malnutrition. Its central innovation is the development of ready-to-use therapeutic food that makes the safe treatment of severely malnourished patients at home feasible and possible, called plumping now. So by providing easy access and reducing the opportunity costs associated with the enrollment in an inpatient therapeutic feeding program, the CMAN model increases the coverage and the impact of humanitarian feeding interventions. It's certainly now promoted as best practice by the UN and a growing number of ministries of health and aid agencies. It's truly a revolution in the making. So building on this groundbreaking work, And in recognition of hunger as a persistent global crisis, the Irish government decided to prioritise the eradication of hunger and launched the Hunger Task Force in 2008. And I think really I would like to pay tribute this time to the work of Tom Arnold of Concern in helping to frame that debate on hunger and the potential that Ireland had to become a global leader, especially in that period leading up to the establishment of the Hunger Task Force. Tom, and you're here today, I know, has been a tireless advocate of food security since taking over as CEO of Concern 11 years ago. I truly salute the work that you've done, Tom. So, we had a clear recognition that the hunger agenda had to go far beyond meeting immediate relief needs to tackling the structural causes of food insecurity and undernutrition. And the urgency of this initiative was borne out by the 2007-2008 global food security crisis. So the Irish Hunger Task Force and its report is the framework that now guides us in our response to addressing global hunger, food and nutrition insecurity. We focus on three priority areas where we feel we can best contribute to combating global hunger. One, targeting undernutrition, in particular in infants, children and mothers. Two, supporting initiatives focused on boosting agricultural productivity in poor smallholder farmers, and particularly with a focus on women farmers. And then promoting governance and leadership action on tackling global hunger and undernutrition. So these innovations, together with the reforms of the international humanitarian response system, have changed the way we do business. So by seeking to address underlying causes, these initiatives are also very rapid. They're responsive, they're effective, and most importantly, they save life and they do it quicker. But now, looking at future possibilities, it's clear we've made collective progress, great progress, but unfortunately not enough. There's worrying evidence that the scale and scope of disasters will increase significantly over the coming decades. Areas of drought will become drier, water shortages will increase, and hurricanes become more frequent. In vulnerable countries, the confluence of increasing food and fuel prices, rapid urbanization, migration and population growth, together with extreme weather and climate events, are creating havoc. So it's estimated that the costs imposed by global natural disasters will exceed $300 billion per year by 2050. Barring aggressive disaster reduction measures, and I know we'll probably be touching disaster reduction measures later. Sudden onset disasters on the scale of those in Haiti and Pakistan in 2010 will continue to challenge the response system, but so too will a more predictable crisis situation. For example, as we meet here today, we face a looming food security crisis in the Sahel region of Africa, where acute food shortages threaten some 12 million people. According to FAO, 22 countries globally are currently considered to be in a state of protracted crisis. Protracted crisis situations are characterized by recurrent natural disasters or conflict, longevity of food crisis, breakdown of livelihoods, and insufficient institutional capacity to react to the crisis. The worst affected region, as we know, is sub-Saharan Africa, where many countries are now suffering protracted food emergencies. 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have declared a food emergency every year for the past 10 years. In other words, we now know more about which parts of the world are particularly vulnerable to crisis. We can predict better, and so we need to plan better. We can no longer afford to provide funding for disasters primarily after the fact. The costs are high and rising, and indeed negating development, long-term development. And yet the international community still operates on a model that is largely reactive and focuses on short-term crises rather than looking at the longer-term trends and their humanitarian implications. Ladies and gentlemen, the international humanitarian response system is not sufficiently focused on the challenges of predictable emergencies, even though, in many cases, it's the same humanitarian system, by default or by design, that is called upon to respond to these very challenges. We have a close working relationship with the defence forces in Ireland. And I'm always struck by the fact that the military spend about 90 to 95% of their time planning, and maybe 5% of their time doing. In contrast, the humanitarians, we spend about 95% of our time doing, and very little of our time planning. So surprise, surprise, we're not as prepared as we need to be. So in order for the international humanitarian response system to be able to plan and react accordingly, I have 3 concrete suggestions for consideration. 1, we should be linking relief, rehabilitation and development. 2, we should strengthen the partnership and work better together. And 3, we should invest in local capacities. First, linking relief, rehabilitation and development. Prevention and preparedness are the core strategies in our fight against hunger. If we don't take action now, many of the advances made in addressing food and nutrition security will be eroded or lost due to recurring emergencies. So in this changing world, linking relief, rehabilitation and development is an approach which can help to plan and prepare for crises and reduce their adverse impacts on development. Essentially, the rationale is that better development can build resilience, reduce the need for emergency relief, and that better relief can contribute to longer-term food security and sustainable development. Let me give you an example. In a previous incarnation, when I was heading up our own humanitarian response section in Irish Aid, I was struck by the realization that year in, year out, we were being asked to provide emergency food aid support in Ethiopia. Meanwhile, our development program on the ground was working in parallel, and each year seemed to be taken by surprise that a minimum of 5 million people, regardless of the weather events, required humanitarian assistance. So on closer analysis, it was clear to me that we were using scarce and precious emergency aid to respond to what was at core a chronic, predictable food insecurity problem. Really a light bulb moment. Predictable needs or crises require coordinated and predictable responses. So to the collective effort of the government of Ethiopia and development partners, USA particularly, the Productive Safety Nets program was established. So importantly, it involved closer links between development and humanitarian science, and to address the root causes of food and humanitarian insecurity. Using government systems, the Productive Safety Nets program now provides timely and predictable transfers of income or food in exchange for labour or public works. So the program bridges the food gap for over 7 million people and enables those people to protect household assets. So cash transfers to consumers have also been very effective in addressing hunger and nutrition, thanks to the multiplier effect on the economy and stimulation of local trade. They also fund labour-intensive public works as well. But I think as significant, however, is the fact that the program helps to reduce the risk of future humanitarian crises. These were the households that were protected from the worst effects of the crisis in 2011. It's been very, very successful. So this is linking relief, rehabilitation, development at its very best. And we need to do it more systematically, more consciously, more proactively, and importantly, more urgently. So we'll certainly be using Ireland's forthcoming EU presidency as an opportunity to place greater emphasis on the links between relief and development activities. Second proposal is about partnership. We in Irish Aid contend that we cannot apply yesterday's solution to tomorrow's challenges, that we need to do things differently in order to cope with the changing nature of crises. Part of doing things differently is working more collaboratively and planning better. MDG 8 is all about global partnership. So what better example, I think, to draw upon than the joint US-Irish partnership, which aims to put hunger at the forefront of international development policies. Since 2010, Ireland and the United States have worked together through the 1,000 Days Initiative to support the efforts of the UN Secretary General and his Special Representative, David Nabarro, by using our joint political capital in support of the scaling of nutrition of the Sun Movement. The Sun Movement is unprecedented global consensus about what is needed to tackle hunger and brings together government, civil society, development partners, the United Nations, and the private sector to support government's own efforts to address maternal and baby undernutrition. Ireland, together with the US, is leading the alignment of Sun donors in Tanzania and Malawi. We in Ireland are also supporting efforts in Ethiopia, Zambia, and Uganda. So 27 countries backing the scourge of undernutrition have signed up to the Sun Movement, and over 100 organizations are supporting their efforts. So the Sun Movement, I think, has the potential to make a sustainable difference in the lives of millions of children. But we all need development partners, governments, at local as well as regional and national levels, donors, multilateral institutions, civil society, private sector, and others to coordinate their actions, especially where it matters most, and that's at the country level. And we have new partners to think about as well. We've had an explosion of NGOs in recent years, but also a change in the donor landscape. We must engage with the new donor architecture, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other potential partners, including donors and organizations from the Arab and Muslim worlds as well. So I think the international community needs to better and more respectfully engage with these new players. Forging smart, strategic partnerships is one enormously important way for the international humanitarian community to better respond to today's growing humanitarian challenges. If we work together, I really think the potential is incredible. Third suggestion is on the importance of investing resources at the local level to build resilient communities. This is vitally important within the context of the increasing fragility of people and communities, where the poorest and the most vulnerable are disproportionately affected by disasters. It helps to strengthen local capacities and harness the resources available to communities to enable them to prevent, mitigate, and cope with disasters. We need to support innovative efforts to help those communities prepare for and limit the effects of future emergencies, and to bounce back and build back better when tragedy does strike. I think it's important to remember that the people affected by crisis and disaster survive and they recover mainly on their own. They sell goats, take children out of school, secure loans, change the crops they plant, share food with their neighbours, skip meals, get money from family members and migrate. So it's fundamentally important to understand people's own coping strategies and the local institutional context and tailor our assistance accordingly. This includes supporting people's capacities to deal with shocks and crises before they even happen. There's a photograph in my office back at home. It's a simple photograph of two members of the local community in rural Bangladesh on a small motorbike. One man is driving, while the other is shouting into a megaphone announcing warnings of impending danger to villagers. For me though, I think this picture represents perfectly the theme of local capacities for prevention, preparedness and action. In the context of the photograph, the local community has clearly taken action. They've devised a plan for dealing with impending crises, part of which involves very simple yet highly effective early warning system operating at the local community level. So this approach helps not only to save lives, but also people's livelihoods. Because in a country like Bangladesh, so prone to large-scale and devastating flood emergencies, there's little doubt that such an approach saved lives, countless lives probably, during the cyclone crisis in November 2007. So local communities have shown a desire to take on increased responsibilities in responding to crisis, and the international community, I think, all of us should welcome and harness that capacity. So look, the challenges ahead are enormous, no doubt about that, but let's keep things in perspective. The opportunities are also enormous. We can build on the reforms in development cooperation and the humanitarian response over the last decade. There's also much good news emanating from the developing world, especially Africa, and this needs to be built upon, and that can be the subject perhaps of a forum next year. But we must continue to work on bridging the gap between emergencies and development. We must work more collaboratively and effectively as partners, such as the partnership between Ireland and the United States. And we need to continue to build the capacities of those who can make a real difference, and that is the communities on the ground. I think if we work together on these three fronts, I believe that within a generation, we can eradicate acute malnutrition, and we can seriously reduce the extent and impact of natural and man-made disasters. And that's a very optimistic note. I'm an optimistic person. I first landed in Africa in February 1987 as a junior professional officer with the United Nations Development Programme. I was full of energy and spirituality and motivation, passion, I think. And I wanted to do things and make a difference. And of course, Zambia in those days was a one-party state. It had a huge debt burden, 150% debt ratio. The apartheid system was still in place. There was a great deal of suspicion, and the economy was going nowhere. There was a president who was a decent man who I met a few months ago, Kenneth Kaunda, who turned 88 a few weeks ago. A good man, but absolutely moribund political leadership. And I remember after about 2 months, I was still full of optimism. I was at a particular party, and sometimes in Africa there's a lot of technical advisors and professionals who become rather cynical of too many years working in the field. And one man turned to me and said, well, you know what, Brendan, give you 6 months and then you'll change your tune. And I thought, you know, if I change my tune in 6 months, I'm leaving this business. And that was 25 years ago, and I'm still here, and I'm still as optimistic as that. Thanks.
I'd like to ask the first panel to come to the table. I have the honor of chairing this first panel. What we're going to do is keep each of the speakers to roughly 15 minutes, and then there'll be questions and answers afterwards. So if Neil and Tom, Cormac, David, you have your seats, and we'll begin. I'd like to. We're going to look right now at the role of history. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Cormac O'Grada. Cormac is a professor at University College Dublin, School of Economics. He is the author of many books and scholarly articles, especially Famine, A Short History, Black 47 and Beyond the Great Irish Famine, in History, Economy, and Memory, Ireland, A New Economic History, and Jewish Ireland in the Age of Choice, which I'd love to see Cormac bring into this conversation as well. So, Cormac, as soon as I think we have it up now, and on with the program.
Well, Gorilla Margaret, Stas Shaw. I have a talk which might take 20 minutes. I'll try to keep to that. And I think too, since I have a text and since we're working to a sharp time constraint, I'll stick to it more or less. I'll try to be a bit provocative in places, which I hope you don't mind. It's early in the day. But let me begin by saying that 3.5 decades ago, John Post, a historian at Northeastern University, produced a fine book with the title The Last Great Subsistence Crisis of the Western World. The book was about the famine that followed the dark summer, or the summer that never happened, in 1816, when, in Lord Byron's words, the bright sun was extinguished and the icy earth swung blind and blackened in the moonless air. I don't need to tell you that John Post's striking title was a misnomer. Famine, and I define famine here as a shortage of food or purchasing power that leads directly to excess mortality from starvation or hunger-induced diseases, would not be eliminated from the Western world for another 130 years. The dubious distinction of last subsistence crisis in the Western world goes to what was then the Soviet Socialist Republic of Moldova in 1946-47. Now, little has been written about the Moldovan famine, and what has been written has been colored very much by the Cold War. But this was not a small famine, relatively speaking. Perhaps about 1 in 15 of a population of 2.5 million perished. 2 generations on, the famine remains a highly contentious and emotive issue in Moldova itself. One aspect that makes its memory more fraught, and I think that serves as a useful reminder of how horrific famine can be, is the gruesome suggestion that the eating of corpses took place on a large scale. The authorities were aware of this at the time and sought to stamp it out. Indeed, they showed Alexei Kosygin, who was then a candidate Politburo member sent from Moscow to investigate, a dead body that had been prepared for eating. There were stories of murder cannibalism, including one of a peasant woman, and I'm quoting here, from the village of Tambula in Balti district, who had killed 2 of her 4 children, a girl of 6 and a boy of 5, with a view to eating. Now, history is in fact pockmarked by famine, and cannibalism is famine's darkest secret. It is not a feature of all famines, and sometimes indeed it is invoked as a trope or a motif to try and give the sense that famines are cataclysmic. But I think it was more common than generally imagined. There are hints and denials of it during many Irish famines, including the Great Irish Famine. One account during the famine refers to John Connolly, a Connemara man who had been convicted of sheep stealing and sentenced to 3 months hard labour, since, and I quote, "an end should be put to such practices or that no man's property could be safe." The sentence prompted a resident magistrate to intervene. Mr. Dockley, and I quote here from a newspaper account, resident magistrate stood up and addressing the court said that he felt bound to explain to the court that he knew of this case. He had been told that the prisoner and his family were starving when this offence had been committed. One of his children had died and he had been credibly informed that the mother ate part of its legs and feet after its death. He had the body exhumed and found that nothing but the bones remained of the legs and feet. A thrill of horror pervaded the court at this announcement. There was deep silence for several minutes, during which time many a tear trickled down the cheeks of those present. Even the court wept, and the prisoner was instantly discharged. Now, such evidence of sympathy for what we would consider an unspeakable act is by no means unique during famines. And again, I dwell on this kind of horrific aspect just to insist on how awful famines are. Sometimes we get very sanitized accounts of famine, but famine is almost as bad as it can get. At the height of a major famine in the Soviet Union in 1922, Communist Party newspapers carried reports of cannibalism for their shock value, and a poster on display in Moscow read, and I quote, "These people who eat their dead because they are hungry are not cannibals. Cannibals are those who don't give their surplus to the hungry." Again, in New Guinea, towards the end of World War II, some Japanese troops, prohibited from surrendering and cut off from food supply chains, resorted to cannibalism. In Kazuo Ohara's disturbing documentary film about that period, former soldier Kenzu Okuzaki more than once states that he did not condemn the perpetrators, but, and I quote him, "those who put them in that situation." Now, these are unsettling stories, but I recycle them here only because they are useful reminders of how awful famine is. And this is, I think, something that is perhaps sometimes lost in the awareness and marketing campaigns of charity agencies, NGOs, who tend to confuse images of malnutrition, which remains endemic in poor countries, and we already have had evidence of that, with the stark horrors of famine itself. The graphic images of famine produced by 19th century NGOs and others capture the horrors of famine more faithfully than the often softened and feminized images familiar to us. For example, if you enter the words NGO and famine in Google and you click on images, this is the kind of thing you get. But the reality is much, much worse. This is from Western India in the 1870s. Again, but you cannot imagine NGOs today using images like this, although they are closer to truth. In the same way, this is an image used by an NGO seeking help for a famine in northern China in the late 1860s, and it's a depiction of cannibalism. Now, why do we see this? One reason might be that the famines we witness today through the lenses of NGOs and the media are less horrific than those in Moldova or in Madras or in northern China. That's one possibility. The historical reality of cannibalism has been absent from the most recent famines in Africa. I've no doubt about that. I've seen one or two claims, but I haven't seen any really hard evidence of cannibalism in the famines that we're familiar with. Now, this could be due to what the late Norbert Elias would have called the civilizing process. But it could also be because the famines we are more familiar with were less apocalyptic by global historical standards. Indeed, it's worth stressing that the few famines we have had in the new millennium have been, by historical standards, very small. Malawi was the epicenter of a broader food crisis threatening southern Africa just a decade ago. In April 2002, Malawi's president asked for aid to deal with the crisis that had put 3/4 of the population at risk, and almost immediately UN agencies and NGOs set about addressing Malawi's what was called worst food crisis in half a century. Then, according to the BBC, in May 2002, at least 10 million people faced starvation in 4 southern African countries. Yet we know that the resultant death toll in Malawi was low. In March 2002, an official source reported that about 100 Malawians had died from hunger-related illnesses from the beginning of the year, while NGO sources informed the BBC that, and I quote, more than 300 people had died of hunger in the previous 2 months. The higher estimates of, and I quote, at least 500 to 1,000 or 1,000 to 3,000 proposed by famine specialist Stephen Devereux of the University of Essex imply an increase of about 1% above the non-crisis death rate. So by historical standards, we're talking about, thankfully, a small famine. Now, the same is true of Niger in 2005. And again, I have lots of detail here, but I don't have time to go through it, except to say that there is a big contrast between the warnings beforehand and the calculations in the wake of the crisis by medics and by demographers. Now, it is too soon to pronounce on Somalia, where a famine was declared in July last year, and where as recently as last September, the UN was claiming, and I quote, as many as 750,000 people could die, or more than during the Derg famine in Ethiopia during the mid-1980s. Yet in early February 2012, that prospect had been converted into a UN declaration that the Somali famine was over. The UN added that tens of thousands of people have died after what is said to be East Africa's worst drought for 60 years. But I would ask the question here, how can we be sure? Because it's not easy to separate excess from normal mortality, given that Somalia has not held an official census since 1975. And that, I quote, population counting in Somalia is complicated by the large number of nomads and by refugee movements in response to famine and clan warfare. Now, popular understanding of famine nowadays depends very much on images conveyed by the media, which poses, I would argue, its own problems. One is that journalists like Hilary Anderson, who first announced the Somali famine on the BBC, are not good at distinguishing between ordinary, everyday misery on the one hand and famine on the other. Another is that they, and NGOs it must be said, have a record of exaggerating the danger and the incidence of famine. The most notorious instance of this, I think, relates to Niger, and we can probably debate this. There are people here who probably know more about Niger than I do. But here I quote the Norwegian activist Esther Garvey, who was living in Niger during the famine. And I quote her because she is provocative, and I want to be provocative. As long as major institutions within the aid industry can continue to take credit for saving people from catastrophes that have never taken place, casting blame on those who say otherwise, often the local governments, the poor will be even poorer as hasty relief campaigns built on untruthful events leave people and societies in lesser known parts of the world worse off than before the intervention. There is something gone badly wrong when the world of aid, born out of a desire to help, has become an industry that in its desire for monetary growth is willing to tamper with the truth, not caring for the dignity and independence of people whom they claim to assist. Now, I know Esther Garvey is a bit of an Ibsenite, difficult person, who raises awkward questions, but nevertheless, the accusation she makes is not new or unique to her. As long ago as 1929, the Chinese arm of the American Red Cross sharply criticized a rival NGO on the grounds that, and I quote, a permanent organization involves continuing expense from one famine to the next for salaries and other items of upkeep, that inasmuch as the life of the organization depends upon receipts from relief contributions, there must always exist, perhaps unconsciously, an urge to discover in every period a serious crop deficiency, a reason for calling on public for contributions, before thoroughly exploiting the possibility of meeting the situation by more ordinary methods. And the problem persists, with the result that sometimes we don't know who to believe. Thus, in July 2011, Abdiweli Mohammed Ali, Prime Minister of Somalia, accused his adversaries in Al-Shahab of, and I quote him, keeping out international aid workers despite a worsening famine. At that time, the UN had just declared a famine in two southern regions, Bakul and Lower Shabelle. However, by mid-December, in Ali's view, this is just a few months later, had become what he calls an entrenched interest group who exaggerated suffering in order to increase donations. In his tirade against the NGOs, Ali even referred to them as lords of poverty, a reference to Graham Hancock's controversial, fiercely anti-NGO polemic of more than 2 decades ago. Now, I have argued elsewhere that today we have, in fact, reached a point where famine could be history. This is an achievement that we should recognize and commemorate rather than seek to deny. Because there is no lack of other challenges to focus on. Brendan has mentioned some of them. There's HIV, AIDS, there is the fight against hunger, of course. My claim is subject to 2 major crucial caveats. First, saying that famine may be history does not mean that there will never be another famine. What it means is that the risk of major peacetime famine has been reduced to, I think, a fairly low level. And I think that the history of the last decade or so would bear that out. Secondly, ending famine is not the same thing as ending malnutrition or hunger. That is, as the lessons of the past few decades should have taught us, a much more intractable problem. Now, another 5 minutes and I think I can stop. I want to talk a little bit about the history of relief and the NGOs. In Ireland, the historical link between famines and charities, as our NGOs used to be better known, has been very close. In November 1963, very soon after the publication of her classic, The Great Hunger, Cecil Woodham Smith was asked by Muintir Weo, or the Mayo Society, to give a lecture on behalf of Gorta. So the link was made then. Gorta being the Irish Freedom from Hunger campaign. And back in the 1990s, several Irish charities invoked the collective memory of the Great Famine in accounting for Irish generosity towards modern day crises. Now, I have my own views about whether that was historically legitimate or not, but it happened. And then that raises the issue, where does the prospect of famines end then leave the NGOs? Now, it's true that our agencies still spend a good deal of their income on what they call emergencies or emergency and rehabilitation. But it is now a decade and a half since concerns for a strategic plan conceded that famines were likely to be a thing of the past. And it must be said that in Ireland, as elsewhere, there has always been a tension between charities as disaster relief agencies, relying on private charity, and NGOs as institutions and bureaucracies. The private funds associated with famine relief came in unpredictable fits and starts. But salaries and phone bills and rent must be paid week in, week out. So there's a tension there. This dilemma, of course, explains why historically charities that started out in disaster relief, such as Oxfam and Concern, have been transformed into development aid bureaucracies. And it explains why agencies like Goal, who enter places like Niger for the first time, during a disaster, or what is perceived internationally as a disaster, are very slow to leave. So John O'Shea went in during the famine in Niger, and he's still there. The historical decline of famine has also coincided, and here again to be a bit provocative, with the virtual morphing of our NGOs in the new millennium into what have become virtual semi-state bodies. The early history of all of Ireland's aid agencies is one of overwhelming reliance on private charity and volunteering, on a form of social capital, if you like. It's building on kind of some strengths in society. But that is less the case today than it used to be. Thus today, 1/4 of Gold's income comes from Irish aid, another quarter comes from USAID, and a further fifth from the UK, the EU, and UNICEF, government and international intergovernmental agencies. Similarly, agencies like that were responsible in 2010 for something like 3/5 of Concern's income, and for 2/5 of Troper's income. And so this is a long way from what development expert Peter Gill has described as shaking tins in pubs and workplaces and on street corners. Concern was conceived as Africa Concern in late 1967 out of concern for war and famine in Nigeria. And its first effort at fundraising was a jumble sale. Here I think that would be called close yard sale or something like that. But today, as the biggest Irish NGO by far, it handles a budget of something like 4 times my university. Huge budget. With that, of course, goes tremendous responsibility. Moreover, today, well over 1/4 of Irish foreign aid is dispensed through NGOs. The sums involved are huge. And one then has to ask some questions. Has the ready availability of state funding compromised the activism and the early idealism of NGOs? Has it changed them in some way? Has it dented or crowded out the private charity that used to be their wellspring? If not, has it influenced the direction and energies of NGOs? Is this the best way of tackling world hunger? Maybe it is. Have the links between NGOs and government become just a little bit too close for comfort? Or what is the ideal distance between the two? Should there be a cap on what proportion of NGO funding comes from institutional dollars? Trocara has such a cap and worries about that situation, I think, more than some other NGOs. But to me, this is a potential problem. One might also want to ask, how do Irish agencies compare with those in the UK and elsewhere in this respect? Are our NGOs trying to become more like agencies elsewhere, or do they want to differentiate themselves in some way? As an avid fan of the GAA, I find echoes here of the continuing controversy in Ireland about volunteering versus professionalism. But of course, that is trivializing what is a much more serious point. Finally, it's vital, given their increasing influence, that the agencies get it right. And I think they are trying to get it right. Amartya Sen, the great Indian-born Harvard-based economist, famously claimed in the 1990s that eliminating famine nowadays is easy, in his words. And he was right, and I agree with that. But eliminating hunger, the focus of today's conference, is not easy. Both the history of the past half-century or so and research by the best economists in the field tells us that eliminating poverty and its handmaiden malnutrition is not at all as straightforward as the marketing agencies and street canvassers employed by some of our development agencies imply. Development continues to be constrained by corruption, by vested interests, by power politics, by the lack of human rights, by geography, by poverty, by ignorance, by cynicism, and I think also by false analysis. We mustn't pretend that the goals we have set ourselves are easier than they really are. So at least we have the whole day to discuss some of these and other issues. For me, Mark, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Cormac. That was a brilliant beginning of the panel. I think that Tom will certainly have something to say to that. Tom Arnold has for the last 11 years been CEO of Concern Worldwide. Brendan spoke earlier about his work in combating hunger and malnutrition. He is a member of the International Food Policy Research Institute. He's been a key architect on the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, as well as an advisor to the member to the Irish government's Hunger Task Force, and a member of the UN Millennium Project's Hunger Task Force as well. Tom, are you going to stand, or are you going to, you'll be here. So without further ado, Tom Arnold. And I will say that we will have question and answers following all of the speakers, just so we know.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and it's really a great pleasure to be part of this event, and to follow on from Brendan's, I think, very substantial statement of policy, important, and Cormac's, I think, excellent critique. And he said he wanted to be controversial, and I think he made some indeed controversial points. I mean, some of them I don't have time to respond to, but certainly they could be responded to over a glass of wine, Cormac. But and I do actually agree with a great deal of what he said. One important point he makes is that the risk that at times NGOs exaggerate the seriousness of situations for their own benefit in terms of raising funds. I would just say, and linking it to the point of the terrible nature of famine, that I plead not guilty to that charge. And last year, when we went into Somalia to look at the East African drought situation, the very first day I was there, I was being interviewed by Jim Fahey on the radio, on the television, and I said, in my 10 years as head of Concern, I had never used the word famine. And precisely because I understand the difference between the terrible nature of famine and what if you like, ordinary hunger is about. So that point is well made. There are, I mean, many of the other aspects of the critique, I would like to either agree with it or disagree with parts of it, but I don't actually have the time here. I was very conscious in coming to speak on this panel, and that it was to be called history, that, I mean, it is a bit intimidating to be asked to talk about the history of famine in the company of Cormac O'Rourke, who is by any standards one of the world's foremost authorities on this topic. And his recent book, Famine, A Short History, is a masterpiece, and it's a result of 40 years of magnificent scholarship. And it was actually reviewed by David Reef, a very fine review as well. Last week I was in Malawi to look at some of the work we do there in conservation agriculture, and in the coming and the going and the aeroplanes, I brought 2 books with me to read on the basis that I was speaking here today. One of them was Thomas Kennelly's very fine book called 3 Famines, which examines the nature of the Irish famine, the Bengali famine in the 1940s, and the Ethiopian famine. And the second book was Cormac's 1988 book, a short book about his giving his then thinking about the Great Irish Famine. He's obviously expanded on that much more. Certain strong commonalities emerge when one looks at these, if you like, 2 books, and what lessons and what conclusions one draws about famine. The strong political nature that underpins famine. Famine is, as Amartya Sen said, and it's contestable to some degree, famines don't occur in democracies. But there are aspects of these 3 famines that Kennelly examined which show that the political realities there greatly deepened the scale of the tragedy. the human responses that Cormac talked about, whether it be cannibalism or various other forms of coping to these disasters, is also evident. You know, last year in Somalia, when we got there eventually to Mogadishu, there were some echoes in that I met people, women, who had left their older brethren or their weaker children behind them. So there were echoes of famine in Somalia. What has to be explained is how what appeared with all the evidence, including the UN declaration on the 21st of July last year, that there was a famine in 2 regions inside Somalia, that did not translate into wide-scale loss of life later in the year. We've actually been looking at that precise question in concern, because I believe it is of crucial importance that if you raise the alarm and then something that does not eventuate, there have to be reasons for that. So far as we can find the reasons, it is about the role of the private sector. That there were, private sector was largely working in Somalia last year. And one of the big pushes from July through to August, September, was the distribution of food vouchers, and vouchers that people was giving purchasing power to people. And it was the exercise of that purchasing power, allied to the fact that there were goods in the marketplace, that was a very significant factor. The other question that is probably an explanation is the significant role of Islamic countries and agencies that actually got food into there. Anyway, that is by way of introduction. I didn't, this wasn't, but I think Cormac's critique is a very fine start to the conference. I wanted to look at, like in dealing with history, I wanted to look at this issue through, if you like, 4 narratives. The global, the US policy, Irish policy and concern. And I'll try to pull this together at the end. And I am conscious of time then, and I will try to stick to that. If we look at the global situation, from, if you like, the 1960s, I think that the time frame of reference here of relevance to this discussion is the 1950s. The late 1960s had the prospect that you were going to have global starvation, or starvation in certain key parts of the world. Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, predicted that millions would die. And then the Green Revolution came along, Roman Borlaug's discovery of new plants, etc. And over a very few short years, the food situation had transformed, in Asia particularly, laying down the foundations of the whole economic development in that continent in the subsequent decades. But what you also had in the early 1970s was this food price crisis. You had what was called the Great Russian Grain Robbery, whereby a lot of US stocks were sold to Russia, and there was a shortage of stocks. Prices went up, coincided with the oil crisis. So this was a very significant spike in food prices. It led to the 1974 first World Food Congress, at which Henry Kissinger famously declared that in 10 years no child will go to bed hungry. But from that point on, for the next 30 years, the real prices of food fell consistently. And the result of that was that governments, both in developing countries and aid agencies who were supporting those governments in developing countries, if you like, disinvested in agriculture. And that was in fact, that was a significant consequence. But by the time you got to 2004, with 30 years of this trend, falling real food prices, what you did have was a significant improvement, if you like, in the global hunger problem. 1969, you had about 3 billion people in the world, and about 25% of those 3 billion were hungry. 2004, you had something over 6 billion people, and about 14% of that larger population were hungry. So a lot had been achieved over those 30 years. But you were then beginning to see at the beginnings of a turning point. The underlying reasons for the changed global food economy was that demand had increased, and was increasing with new types of food demand, particularly from China and India. On the supply side, you were getting slowing down agricultural rates of productivity. You were also getting weather factors which were coming into play. And so from about 2005 to 2007, you had a significant spike in food prices, what we call the food price crisis of 2008. It led to food riots in 30 countries in the first half of 2008. So suddenly food was back on the agenda again. Food security was back on the agenda again. And you had also some other signals that there was a change in global thinking about food. A World Bank document in 2006 called Repositioning Nutrition, which was acknowledging the critical importance of nutrition, particularly for early childhood level. In 2008, a series by The Lancet, which spelled out the costs of malnutrition. And 2008 as well, the World Development Report of the World Bank on agriculture, which were the first one since 1982, which acknowledged the important part. So that, if you like, is part of the framing, the global framework in the past 40 to 50 years. At US level, the US, particularly in the time frame here, I want to choose to talk about is the Obama administration. Because I think in his inaugural address, President Obama gave a clear signal that the US wanted to establish some leadership in this field. And that, following on from that, at policy level, the Feed the Future policy is the expression of that. And Hillary Clinton, I think, has made a remarkable level of commitment to the first 1,000 days, the importance of nutrition in the first 1,000 days during pregnancy and in the first 2 years of life. In Ireland, Brendan has comprehensively covered the development of thinking in regard to both humanitarian response and on the outside. I'd just like to pick out a couple of relevant areas for this discussion. In 2006, the white paper, the government white paper, said had hunger and food security as one of the 4 pillar priorities for the Irish Aid Programme. And Brendan has mentioned the importance of the Hunger Task Force, which I think has been of central importance. And again, just to emphasise what that said it should be prioritised. Productivity of small African agricultural farmers, especially women, the importance of nutrition, and the importance that Ireland would play a leadership role at international level on this issue. And the other aspect that as a metric as to how that would be that the Irish Aid Programme should spend 20%, at least 20% of its budget on the issue of hunger and food security. In terms of concern, and this is the 4th of my pillars before I start trying to integrate things, concern was, as Cormac quite rightly says, born in the famine of Biafra, and has been a participant and has been a responder to all of the significant food crises and emergency crises in the intervening 43 years. Brendan mentioned the important role of community therapeutic care, what is now CMAM, community management of acute malnutrition. And he talked a bit about the important role of a new therapeutic food as part of this. It is that, but it's only part of it. What this means is this different way of treating severe acute malnutrition is a whole number of things. It's about using local resources. It's about making sure that women are incentivized to bring their children for treatment at a much earlier stage. It's about making sure that things are dealt with on a community and a local basis rather than a health systems basis. In summary, it's about bringing food to the people rather than the people to the food. But the critical point that Brendan made is the important one, that this is a potential revolution in how we deal with severe acute malnutrition. That's something we have to be proud of. Some of the other work that we Concern has been doing is now focusing on the next great challenge, is how to prevent children particularly, moving into acute malnutrition. And we're working particularly there on the issue of stunting. The fact that in many African countries you have 40 to 50% of the children are actually stunted. What set of measures can be brought to bear to significantly reduce that level? On the advocacy front, we have Concern has been consistently saying that we want Ireland to play this leadership role. In 2006, in a paper I suggested that Ireland should be to hunger what Norway is to conflict, that we should have capacity and the passion to to advocate for this at international level. And I think over the past 3 to 4 years, in the way the Irish government has taken this seriously, we are definitely moving in this direction. So in concluding and trying to bring things together, I think the famine reality, whatever about, and there is a discussion to be had on whether it has given that whole national consciousness about engaging with hunger for the rest with the rest of the world or not, but that reality is actually shaping the Irish aid policy. The fact that it is a central objective of what Irish aid and Irish foreign policy is trying to do is a reality that I welcome. In coming together with the SUN, the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement, this potentially, for me, could be one of the most significant international developments for a very considerable time. It's focusing on the right issue. It has got the engagement at this stage of 27 governments. It's been the recipient of serious leadership at international level. And the challenge now is to translate those high-level statements of principle into real results on the ground. And this is where a combination of the Irish and US governments have a really critical role to play. And I think that's the challenge. For Ireland, the fact that we are putting this focus on hunger, it's the right thing to do morally, in terms of global human security and economic, but is also significant political benefit to Ireland. To be seen to be leading on this crucially important issue, on a matter which is so understandable to the Irish people and to the rest of the world, that this is an issue that we want to provide leadership. And I think that is perhaps the importance of today's conference as well, that we are examining these matters in an objective way, in a spirit of free inquiry and robust debate. And I hope maybe the rest of the day will continue with this in this tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Our next speaker is Neil O'Dow. Neil O'Dow is an Irish journalist living and working in the United States. He's the founder of the Irish Voice newspaper, Irish American Magazine, Irish Central, the Global Irish Internet website. He's also been a key player in both the Irish Good Friday Peace Agreement as well as comprehensive immigration reform in the United States. He's the author of 2 books, and I give to Mr. Neil O'Dow.
Thank you very much, Brendan. I just came back from Ireland, where I spoke at the annual famine conference, which was held in my hometown of Drogheda this year. And it was a very interesting occasion for me, because growing up in Drogheda, I was never told or ever aware of the fact that it's the 2nd largest port where people left Ireland to go to Liverpool to come to America. And it just put in context for me, because so many of us growing up in Ireland did not know anything about the famine really, apart from the very dry historical reality that was presented in the history books at the time. But yesterday, 3,500 people gathered in Drogheda to hear about the famine. And it's an extraordinary moment, because Ireland is finally, 170 years later, coming to terms with their own famine. And it's a very important development in the context of everything that's been discussed today, because I think it puts in play something that is very, very real, which is the example and the experience of Ireland can be so helpful in the world today. Certainly yesterday when I spoke, I was speaking to a number of school children who in the classes in Drogheda now, and I think hopefully at some point throughout Ireland will have a practical explanation of the history of the famine and how it influenced everything. And we don't think about that enough, because everybody in this room who's Irish American essentially is here because of the Irish famine. I'm an American because of the Irish famine. Without the Irish famine, the population of Ireland would probably be about 13 million now. And we wouldn't have this enormous footprint across the world, which we all talk about. So I think it's very important that we take that into account when we talk about what we can do now. Because I think along with the awareness and the acknowledgement of the famine, there's also an awareness and acknowledgement of the diaspora, which was lacking when I was growing up in Ireland. I think that's a very, very important factor too. And I think the two of them came together beautifully last week in Boston when the new President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, delivered what I would consider one of the best speeches I've ever heard by an Irish politician in Faneuil Hall, where he talked about the history of Boston, the history of the Irish, and of course the history of the famine Irish who landed on the shores there. And he talked about it in the context of what the lesson for the world today was. And I think that's one of the things that we don't think enough about. How this diaspora, this massive 70 million people worldwide, which we're suddenly becoming aware of. And one of the other events I attended in Ireland, along with the ubiquitous Tim O'Connor, who's here again today, was the launch of The Gathering, which is this great effort by the Irish government next year to bring home the Irish diaspora, to bring them back to Ireland. And what is the message that we're going to give them when they get back there? Obviously, there's an economic message. Obviously, there is a political message that Ireland is once again doing okay. But also, I think we need to tell them about our history and how they are part of not just a diaspora, but also a famine community that was started by some great-grandfather of theirs leaving Ireland many, many years ago, probably around the time of the famine. So I think when we look at the extraordinary impact of the Irish worldwide and what we have to teach the world, obviously, from my own experience, a pretty educated guy, not knowing that 2 miles away from where I grew up was one of the great exoduses of the Irish family. And I think from that point of view, it really woke in me the sense that we need to do a lot more about the educational effort we make, about what the Irish went through, but also what the Irish can now contribute because of their experience. I think one of the things that listening to the speakers today made me aware is just when we look at Ireland today, the image of Ireland abroad has been very badly damaged in the last 5-6 years. Every week you'll read Paul Krugman in the New York Times making negative comments about the Irish economy and how it's the poster child for everything that's gone wrong in Ireland. So when you look around for some inspirational stuff about Ireland, you come back, and you come back to organisations like Concern, you come back to organisations like Gold, who I went to Calcutta with them about 10 years ago and had the most amazing experience. Or you come back to a guy like Brendan Rogers who's doing so much on behalf of the Irish government to help. And that's the story that we need to get out there. That in fact, the story of Ireland is, at the moment is also about the kind of people who are, who are helping relieve this extraordinary situation with regards to hunger worldwide. So from my point of view, when you put together the diaspora, and the diaspora is a word that I used in an Irish Times article about 20 years ago, and there were 3 letters in saying, what do you mean an Irish diaspora? There is no diaspora. And there's been a gradual acknowledgement and a gradual recognition of the force and the power of the diaspora in Ireland over the years. The question has never been asked, what are we going to do with that diaspora? Apart from try and get them back to Ireland and spend money in Ireland, what else can we tell them? What else can we ask them to do? And I think part of that question could be answered here today by saying that something like The Gathering, something like the information that goes out through these diaspora forums should be about the extraordinary work and the extraordinary undertaking that has been taken by the people of Ireland, the government and the NGOs to help with worldwide famine. And I think the diaspora could relate very, very well to that, because after all, that's where they came from. And I think the notion that we just need to milk the diaspora, we need to take their money and put it in their pocket and say, haven't we done well? We could ask them to do something far more noble. We could ask them to get involved in this worldwide effort, which the Irish in so many ways are playing above their weight, are playing above their strength. And I think from my point of view, standing in that room in Drogheda at the weekend, and being educated as much as educating, it struck me just how many of us need to know that history. How many of us do not know the history of why we're here today, why this great institution, why Archbishop Hughes got built all those years ago, because of the anti-Irish sentiment that was in America against the people who came here from the famine. So I urge us all to really rethink this issue of famine, diaspora and Ireland, and how we think about it in terms of separating it at the moment, but really, you know, we are children of the famine as much as we are children of the diaspora. And we have so much more we can contribute, but there are so many people in our diaspora who don't know the history, who don't know what has been done on behalf of people from other generations like themselves leaving other countries. So, I mean, briefly, I think that the Irish-American contribution to Ireland needs to go in a different direction. I think we did an amazing job with the peace process. I think there wouldn't have been a peace process without a President Clinton, without a George Mitchell, without many people in this room who helped so much to put together that. And I think there's now need for another accomplishment. The issue of peace in Ireland for our generation has been settled. But the issue of what the Irish can do for the world as against what the world can do for Ireland, which is the question we seem to get asked far more often, still is unanswered. And I think that answer could well be in this room today with the kind of incredible outreach that we can make through our diaspora to join in the battle to deal with world hunger. From my point of view, it's something that I think the silence of the famine is now over. The generations in Ireland that grew up not learning about it. I always remember talking to Peter Quinn about his book, Banished Children of Eve, and how he went back and tried to find out oral testimony from the famine times. People just did not talk about it. It was so devastating for them. And now that we're talking about that, and now that we're talking about the diaspora, I think it's high time we put more together. Thank you very much.
Our last speaker, David Reef, is an old friend. He's a New York-based journalist who literally wrote the book on humanitarianism in the Vet for the Night, Humanitarianism in Crisis, as well as Slaughterhouse, Bosnia and the Failure of the West. Over the last 20-odd years, he's covered conflicts throughout the world. He's currently working on he's finishing his book, The Reproach of Hunger, Food, Justice, and Money in the 21st Century. David sits as a member on the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a fellow of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU, and a board member of the Central Eurasia Project of the Open Society Foundation. To finish off this panel, last but not least, David Reef.
Well, first of all, thank you. I think I'm somewhat here under a false pretense. I obviously don't have the right to an opinion about what Ireland should do about, relating hunger to the past, as Dad said, or some of the things the Director General said. So I think what I'm going to do for the most part is to talk about belief in development, which I am actually said to know something about. You'll be the judge. I should start by picking up on a point that Tom made, which is that obviously there was an Irish ambassador to the UN, Noel Dorr, who wrote a book called, what is it, Small State at the Top Table. A small state has to have a niche. We can argue about the history of whether the memory of the famine is a real memory or it's a constructed memory, whether even the verb remembering 100 and X odd years later is a valid verb. But countries have ideas of themselves, whether historically sustainable or unsustainable. I've written a tiny book about memory, which makes the argument that perhaps some of these memories aren't as accurate as or as helpful as they're sometimes said to be, but that's probably a conversation for another time. What I will say is, obviously as a practical matter, I think what Tom was saying, and I want to echo, is that if you want that seat at the big table, and you're a small country, you have to specialize. That's what the Norwegians did with peace. And they did it, in that sense, on much shakier ground than Ireland. They did it simply because they had this prize that this academy gives out because one rather loony inventor of an armament left the money. It wasn't particularly ingrained in the history of Norway. There's more to the history of Norway, surely, than that. And certainly no one would say, Mr. O'Dowd did, that the famine was at the core of as he said about the famine being, you wouldn't say peace was at the core of Norwegian history. And yet they've done a very good job of making this niche for themselves as a practical matter. But what I want to do, and here Cormac very graciously apologized for saying controversial things. I only have that here. So I don't know if I should so much as, if I apologize for that, I really sort of end up apologizing for being. And I'm not quite there yet. But I want to talk about famine versus hunger. Because I actually think the problem here is, to some extent, terminological. If you take seriously the arguments of Amartya Sen, of Cormac McGrath, of other people who really know what they're talking about famine, we're now actually looking at a point where we may not have famine as a regular development, rather than as a surprise. In other words, there probably always will be famines, but there won't be, as it were, a famine every 30 years in some part of the world, which until quite recently is the historical norm. Sir Henry Maine, the great British 19th century jurist, said that it was war, not peace, that was the constant in human history. And to some extent, at least, you can argue that famine was one of the principal constants in human history. That's been broken. It's been broken both in the sense that most famines are smaller, as Cormac said, and increasingly they're political. That is, the role of nature, of bad weather, of too much rain, of a cyclone, etc., is a diminishing part of the story. Now, we can argue about whether casualties are lower because of new technologies like Plumpy Nut, or simply rapid deployment of trained people. And I mean, there are lots of things you can say and argue about that. But it does seem, absent really apocalyptic scenarios like, say, 6-degree climate change, that we're not going to see famines in the future. So simply as an outsider, neither Irish nor Irish American, I would say, I would just raise a kind of admonitory finger and say, if your idea is to make famine the subject of your international aid effort, that I think would be an error, because I actually do think there'll be fewer of them. And there is a problem with exaggerating. You know, the relief agencies don't just exaggerate hunger. Take Rwanda. In Rwanda, it was said by the UN in Congo at the time of the after the genocide that if people came back, hundreds of thousands would die. Well, they didn't die. I mean, agency after agency, in my view, the worst offender has been historically since Cambodia days Oxfam, but then I do sort of like to pick on them. Full disclosure, I sort of am a friend of the House of Doctors Without Borders, and so come with most of their prejudices and a few that even they've jettisoned to the interim. Famine isn't hunger, and it's true, of course, that famine is the ultimate hunger, but the problem of hunger in the 21st century is not fundamentally the problem of famine. It's not even the problem of acute malnutrition. To the contrary, it's the problem of chronic malnutrition. This is probably the one thing that Tom said that I don't entirely agree with, where he said, where he talked about stunting. You can perfectly well imagine those terrible statistics that he offered, not leading to much acute malnutrition. That is to say, steady state chronic malnutrition. What's the classic example of it? Where's ground zero of chronic malnutrition? Well, it's India. What is India's greatest success? Banishing famine, historically. So the two coexist perfectly well. You've got an Indian government that has been brilliant in its famine efforts. It took the British hunger codes, fixed them up a bit, and there have been moments, to be accurate, where it's looked like there'd be famine in several states in India, and it's never tipped over. And certainly, again, Tom is absolutely right to signal the Green Revolution. There's an issue of sustainability about the Green Revolution. Again, that's another conversation. But at the time, it probably did avert famine. At least it's reasonable to think it may well have done. But there is no correlation between success in famine, in reducing, limiting mitigating, and then stamping out quickly if you have to intervene after. Between that and chronic hunger. And the problem is, and here I really want to take up the cudgel, I mean, I'm using it more as a cudgel, he's probably more subtle about it than I'm going to be, that Cormac raised to, which is the complexity of fighting hunger, trying to change the global picture of chronic malnutrition. Because famine is cognitively, the way we understand famine, an emergency. It may be an emergency that plays out over a fairly long period of time. It's obviously not the same as a tsunami where most of the people who die in a tsunami die in the first 24 hours, 48 hours. But it has the mode of an emergency, and it can be portrayed in language we're already familiar with from the discourse of emergency that we all have in our heads. And that is the image of something must be done right away. And look at these people, they look so terrible. To be sure, I was fascinated by that Google image of famine that Cormac projected as the first photo slide. I didn't know it was that bad. But one knew pretty much that you can portray it. This is why Sen's point about democracy, which, like Tom, I have some reservations about. The main thing that Sen said was that in democratic societies, you can mobilize people. You can mobilize people through the media. You can mobilize people through pressure groups. I actually prefer the word pressure groups to civil society because I always think civil society is a descriptive term that we all use as a prescriptive term, and that's a grave error. But you can, a free press can show terrible images of a famine and mobilize people. Stunted, mildly stunted or wasted young people, children, don't look particularly terrible. The only way you can show with stunting, normal, average stunting, I'm not talking about when it tips over into acute malnutrition, but most of the cases, say in India, 46% of Indian children are chronically malnourished at present. 46%. They haven't had a famine. If you show, the only way you could do it would be to take a bunch of children from one village and put them next to a bunch of children from, say, another district. That's really not, even then, they would just look shorter. They're not going to look terrible. It's not the swollen belly and the orange hair and all of that. It's not portrayable. So there's one problem. The second problem, which I think is far graver because I think there are difficulties with Sen's, the democracy part of Sen's thesis anyway, not the entitlements. The major difficulty is we now know one thing about reduction of both poverty and generally and malnutrition specifically, which is the variable is not democracy, it's the commitment of the state. And it's not about democracy because I give you as the best example, there are 3 places that have done amazingly well in changing their nutrition statistics. First is Brazil, which is a democracy. Second is Thailand, which is sort of a democracy, sort of not a democracy. And the third is the People's Republic of China, which is very much not a democracy. On the other hand, India, which is a democracy in every sense of the word, has had done very, very bad. They talk a good game at the national level, the union level, but they don't actually do anything. And year in and year out comes and nothing happens. It doesn't get any better. So we do know that the state has to commit itself. So then the question becomes, in an emergency, you can supervene the state. You can say, you can intervene the way outside NGOs and the UN system do in emergency. That's possible. It may not always be advisable, but it's certainly possible. What's not possible is for outsiders to to have the decisive voice in what Brasilia or Bangkok or Beijing or, alas, Delhi or a lot of other countries decide to do. Those are internal matters in which outsiders, no matter how skilled, no matter how well intended, really are going to play a very, very subaltern role. And Brazil is a perfect example of this. Brazil is a country which, until the latter part of the Cardoso government, that is the last government before Labor, socialists came in, did nothing. And the minute the Brazilian state, first under Cardoso in some pilot programs, and then full-throatedly, first with Lula and now with Dilma, Brazilian state committed itself, and the thing was turned on its head. Whether you could reduce the very bottom is another issue. The poverty reduction, problem with poverty reduction is that you can do the sort of middle poor, but the bottom poor are less susceptible to the things we know how to do. So in Brazil, I just came back from Brazil, they're worried that about 16 million people are simply off the grid. That's a little under 10% of Brazilian, 8% of the Brazilian population. And they just don't know how to find them. And they've done very well previously. But it's very, I'll just close with this thought. It's very important that countries, at the best of times, countries are mixed entities morally. There's good and bad, and there's bad even in the best countries. So if you can accentuate the good, Ireland, in the context of this conference, can make as one of its foreign policy planks hunger reduction, that's great. But let's really not imagine that famine is the model, because actually it's not a model, it's a cul-de-sac if you're talking about reducing it.
Thank you, David. We have time for questions this morning, and so moving us right along, those with questions, if I might ask you to use the two microphones if you can, and you can direct it to any of the panelists. Questions, Ambassador.
Maybe I could make a couple of comments as well as a question. Firstly, just to address what David said at the end, and I'm sure some of the other panelists will. It's not that famine is the model, I think. Famine is the inspiration, the root, the trigger of that particular consciousness of this issue in Ireland. But it is hunger and undernutrition that is the focus of this campaign. So I think it's important to make that point. But I had a comment and a question of substance relating to my position as a pastor to the UN. The first comment was I wanted to pick up what Niall talked about and Tom to a degree touched on as well. And that is acknowledging that and Brendan said this very directly, this whole focus in Ireland, I mean, it is rooted obviously in moral grounds. We're all mixed moral entities, as David just said. But the root of this campaign, I mean, it's conscience-driven, there's a moral imperative behind it. But the point I wanted to touch on was the political context and the image benefit of it as well. Because it is particularly at this time when, as you said, we are the subject of the Irish economic difficulties. It's headlined everywhere. We're hammered at it weekly by Krugman and others. And the fact of the effort we are continuing to make with our development aid commitment, and it needs to be told and retold. And I actually find that it is a powerful tool with my colleagues at the United Nations, and with 192 other members of the United Nations, again and again bringing home to them that in the midst of the current period of austerity in Ireland and the very significant domestic cutbacks, that with all of that, yes, we've had to make some adjustments to our aid program, but we are still number 7 internationally in terms of our development aid. We have still this huge impetus of commitment and generosity. And we saw a poll in Ireland 2 weeks ago where 88% of the Irish people were still that is a very powerful statement about the kind of country that we're representing. And I think it does need to, and I've consistently made this point, Duncan, it needs to weave better into the discourse about contemporary Ireland, because I think it is a point that has a huge, and deserves to have a big resonance, that even in the midst of this very difficult period, we can maintain that level of generosity. But the question that I wanted to come to, and it could be for any of the panelists, but maybe more particularly for Cormac, because he tells it like he is, like he finds it, and he's a real researcher in this area, but probably also for Tom to some extent, David. It's the UN and the critique you would have of the UN. I mean, many of the statements have woven in and out of with references to the UN. I mean, do you regard the UN as being complicit in this kind of exaggeration that you have accused the NGOs of? Or has it done sufficient to counterbalance maybe what you would regard as the exaggeration of the NGOs? But more generally, what, and I know everybody's criticism of the UN, easy things to voice criticisms, but I would like to hear from you in specific terms, if you feel that the UN in some ways is getting it wrong and could do better, what would be your specific recommendations for the UN to improve on its dealing with the whole sector?
Yeah, but short, that would quick to answer. And I would be, but yeah, I mean, there was no question but that in the case of Niger in particular, UN people exaggerated around, I think. And like my worry is that if you cry wolf too often, that in the long run, the ramifications for goodwill are quite serious. That relates to issues of disaster. Now, on the issue of hunger and malnutrition, again, I suppose some UN spokesmen make it sound a little bit easier than it really is. That you set goals and all you need to do is to set them, and with little risk of a bit more spending, you can solve the problem. I'm not sure it's as simple as that. And I think like politics does enter into it a lot. The UN cannot really do much about policies pursued by individual countries. And sometimes I think the NGOs might be in a better position to do something along those lines. But when they are so closely tied to governments, I think that makes it more difficult for them. I'm thinking of issues like, for example, in the Irish case, the Common Agricultural Policy, which I believe is doing untold damage to agriculture in poor countries, and in the poorest countries, is crowding out agriculturalists in Africa. And the NGOs must see this on the ground. But of course, policy is to support the common agriculture, government policies to support. So this would seem to me to be an area where there should be conflict and robust argument between the NGOs on the one hand and government on the other. And I'd like to see more of that. And maybe I'd like to see the NGOs distancing themselves and taking a more critical stance on some issues where policies pursued by governments are impeding development.
I'm sure conference organisers always like controversy between panelists, so I mean, Cormac, if I may say so, on that specifically last point, I do think your comments may actually not be quite up to date, because I think it's undoubtedly true that the Common Agricultural Policy of the 1980s and 1990s had exactly the consequences that I think the Common Agricultural Policy nowadays is operating in a very different has been actually a piece of fairly considerable, I think very good research work, which has analysed precisely the issue you're asking about the issue of coherence. It was done by Aaron Matthews. And he came to the conclusion that the effects are quite limited. So I think, for me, that's the most authoritative piece of work on that matter. On the broader question that Pastor Anderson raised about the UN, I do think that in this most recent phase, from, if you like, response to what was called the food price crisis of 2008, the UN has performed well. I think one of the immediate responses, and of course it was a political response, as there were 30 countries that had food riots. The Secretary General in April 2008 set up a high-level task force dealing with, brought together all of the UN agencies who had responsibility for food and food security. And that task force has actually worked quite well. It had the great benefit of being led by David Nabarro. Dr. David Nabarro has, I think, provided outstanding leadership in the UN over the past couple of years on a number of issues. But specifically from 2008 onwards, he has been a tremendous focus. He is also the person who is in charge at this stage within the UN system of driving the scaling up nutrition. And I think Irish Aid has made a very strategic and sensible decision to support him. I think there's also been at other UN agencies, you have leadership in the past few years of Bob Zellick in the World Bank and of Josette Sheeran in the World Food Programme, have both provided substantial and good positive leadership. And I would say the US administration have also stepped up to the mark. So I think the overall international response has been positive. The question then, and it does come back to David's point about the end of the day, it is governments in the countries themselves who have the problems that have to perform. And this is where something like the Sun, scaling up nutrition, it represents, I think, a beacon of hope. But that is only still a beacon of hope. It has to be translated into reality. And that's where some of the arrangement at national level, where governments link with civil society, maybe not protest groups, David, but with all the relevant agencies who are engaged in this issue of hunger reduction. And we're not, let's be clear, we're not talking about famine. We're talking about the reality that the current level of childhood malnutrition is having long-term consequences, both for the children and for the countries, because it is diminishing the whole possibility of if brain development is retarded or damaged in those first 2 years of life, it inevitably has long-term consequences. That's what is being faced up to internationally now. That's the big challenge, and that's what I think the whole world will deliver. And I think Ireland has a critical role to play in trying to spearhead that activity.
Ambassador, and then after the ambassador yourself, if you don't mind. Matt.
Thank you. I would like briefly to introduce myself. My name is Babakir Khalifa. I am the former ambassador of Sudan to South Korea and also former Consul General and Deputy Permanent Representative of Sudan to the UN. Currently, I am Senior Political Advisor to a foundation that deals with humanitarian issues. I would like at the outset to make a brief comment and some questions. I would like to congratulate the speakers on their impressive and lucid remarks on the Irish role in humanitarian assistance. And I would like to emphasize that I came from a famine-stricken area made by drought, stricken drought areas, which is the Sahel region that stretch from West Africa to East Africa. Currently, while we are deliberating and talking on these issues, people are dying from famine, for example, in the Blue Nile, in Sudan, and in southern Darfur. Some man-made causes for this famine and for this hunger. For example, the war which is the main reason the government prevent, for example, the NGOs to provide food in certain areas because they think they have hidden agenda, and the people suffer at the end.
Ambassador, if you
And
could
I
just
was
get
in
to the-
Somalia.
if you just get to the question.
Okay, I was in Somalia with the UN, and even my thesis and dissertation I wrote about the right to food. And I think I do agree with your emphasis on sustainable development, not only humanitarian assistance. But we cannot achieve either humanitarian assistance fully to the needy people, or to maintain a kind of a form of sustainable development unless we as United Nations, civil society organizations, NGOs, academia, we emphasize the sustainable peace and security in the area to stop the war. Otherwise, this syndrome will continue forever. I would like to have your remark on this.
Well, I mean, it's self-evident, I think, that if you have war, conflict, you're going to have consequences for the population, and I think, of course, you should do everything possible to stop the conflict. We know that, I think, and there should be as much as possible efforts. Niall probably is as good a comment on this as anyone else.
I think actually that, you know, when people talk about Somalia and all the other misfortunates, there's a certain amount of media sort of overkill, and people have just stopped listening. I know it's probably a harsh thing to say, but generally speaking, that's been my experience, that there's media fatigue with an awful lot of what has happened. I think that's one of the most unfortunate aspects of it.
Story has it that, of course, everyone is African, and the reason why we're not now actually has to do with cannibalism, because there was no food in Africa, and there was a big cannibalism thing, and people started to flee. And they say most of the facts of this artifacts could be found in Spain, which is the route they took. So that the first part of my question is where can I find more facts about that particular cannibalism phantom thing from the beginning of time? Also, I actually am very frightened of starving to death in the United States. You know, my father was born on a farm in 1917. It's getting very hard and harder for American people to access land and grow food. Also, I notice a lot of our food is coming from Brazil, like Tropicana orange juice, they had to take that off. And I wanted to know if the success of Brazil in part has to do with the fact that we have some kind of, you know, agreement with them in terms of food trade and
I think it's a
purchasing
little
food.
bit off topic, but I don't know if anyone wants to handle that publicly, or Cormac, if you want to speak about it later in terms of, but in terms of the conference today, I'm not sure if.
I don't see how it's off topic. We're talking about cannibalism and starving to death. His last statement was about Brazil and doing well. I don't see how.
I'll answer your question if you want. I don't think there's any secret agreement between Brazil.
I didn't say secret, I just said.
Well, I don't think there's, I mean, they're trade, Brazil is a major agribusiness power.
Mhm.
And they're more powerful by the day. And the Lula government, if you want to talk Brazilian politics, the Lula government has to walk, or feels it has to walk, a very narrow line between satisfying agribusiness on the one hand and satisfying its base, which involves it with land reform and some redistribution of property. At the moment, at least, this government in Brasilia is just as friendly to agribusiness as to an economy largely based on agricultural exports as its right-wing predecessors. That's about all I can tell you.
Thank you. Dominic.
I suppose I just want to respond maybe a little bit to Cormac's opening comments, and Tom Arnold is much more diplomatic than I am. I'm a little bit jet-lagged. So I was in Pakistan for up until yesterday for two reasons. We had a disaster risk reduction workshop where we were working with 70 partners, and we'd done some analysis to try and break out of this whole cycle, I suppose, of having to continuously appeal to the public and to the donors to respond to a global crisis. So everybody knows that disaster risk reduction and resilience are very importantly becoming into the agenda to try and ensure that we start to break out the cycle of having to continuously respond. And prevention, as we know, which we should have probably been addressing much longer before that. So that was one thing that I was in there for, and it was very impressive. And I think the reason I'm talking about this is because it analysed really the depth and the contextual analysis of what we are now doing at countries, particularly countries in Pakistan, which are incredibly complex. And the fact that we're working with 72 local partners, where much of our work is an expression of what they do. So it kind of brings me back a little bit to your point in your rather potted history of concern. And you know, we always have been an emergency and development organisation. We didn't graduate to being a development organisation over the years. And that's always been a challenge, but it's actually been what has distinguished concern from the very beginning. And Cormac, while I really appreciated your kind of thought-provoking, I understood the first half of your presentation, and I failed to understand the second part where you kind of dived into a comparison of budgets.